and I want to make sure that you were able to hear all this.
Yes. I thought that they were fairly standardized or stereotyped positions,
Right.
which I think is what you intended.
That's right.
But to hear them out loud in the same space was very interesting and unique for me, because usually people have the assembly, which I've done many times, of speaking to the choir. And at least in, I don't know, I've probably given 15 or 20 speeches on climate change and sustainability. And it's all people who wanted to come, who responded to the advertisement, and who were not asked to take other positions in the question and answer period. So for me, this is in itself is interesting and, has possibilities. I'm not quite sure how to develop them exactly, but
it's a start. This is really experimental, but it's very interesting to apply this kind of field theory approach to this. This is one of my mentors, Arnold Mindell, who's a neo-Jungian analyst, has done a lot of what he calls global process work, where he has natural, quote, enemies of different countries, Japan and China, all kinds of representatives of different countries come together in this institute, and they have to learn how to represent each other's positions and go more deeply into what those roles are, as opposed to being in a fixed position. And somehow, when that happens, new things start to come out of that. Now, if we had kept that dialogue going, you would see those objects coming closer together, because what they're looking for is common ground. So now I'm going to turn this over to Lucida, who's going to be doing the next part.
Thank you, Marley. This was an incredibly rich experience, I think, for all of us. And just thank you, Marley, for having the vision to conceive of this as a whole, and also your hosting and facilitation of the symbolic modeling of feeling states. Really, really interesting. Now that we've all just experienced that symbolic modeling, and also the larger context in which we're gathering, where you have seen the videos that Maureen, Baeldon, and Bob Eldon have put forward, and no doubt we all come to this conversation with our own perspectives and our own history and work in this sphere. And I just want to take this next 20 to 30 minutes to give us each an opportunity to presence what it is that has been pulled forward for us from this experience of the symbolic modeling and the ground that we've received from Eldon and Baeldon. And so the way we're going to do it is we'll go around the circle to my left, starting with dancers. After me, I'll start and start us off. So for me, it was really interesting being inside that role, that feeling state of just holding fiercely to my own individual needs and perspective. And, and I got to see how there really is a part of me that's like that I don't think of myself as having that peace all that much, but the truth is I do. And it was really surfaced during this process. So I was really intrigued and grateful. And I found the whole exercise really exciting and intriguing. And I'll pass to dancers.
Hi, yes, thank you everyone for, I think, presenting really kind of interesting characters. It was fun to interact and try out the different points of view. And I've been having a lot of technical problems just staying on the internet and on Second Life lately. So I was very aware of how the climate in terms of energy, how were we going to get the energy to sustain something like Second Life? And I was very aware of energy in the real life, climate in the real life. How are we going to sustain to even be on Second Life? And at the same time, what it provides to have this kind of interaction with a really fantasy world. And my area was working on procrastination, which normally I can't afford to do. So it's like you have to have sort of the right setting to be able to do that. And I was aware back and forth of how special it is to be here at all. So thank you, Marley, and everyone.
Or we can pass to Francisco and Carla, and then maybe skip Marley and Baeldon and Eldon for the moment and end with them. Francisco?
Okay, well, I don't have a lot to say. I just wanted to I want to thank everybody for being here, and I think it was a excellent exercise. I think it does give you an appreciation for the different positions. Hearing them, I would like to have heard things go into more depth. I know that we didn't really have time for that, but I think it was a great session as it was. That's about all that I wanted to contribute for now.
I really enjoyed the way everybody presented things, and that was fun and intriguing. It was also somewhat frustrating at points because I think especially, I'm not sure who it was when I was over on the me first side and then the other people were over on the spiritual side, and one of you said something about how hard it was, and that's kind of what I had been experiencing when I was in that role opposite you when you were on the me first, how hard it is to talk across that big divide. And because it's almost like we are coming from different planets, and I think we can all get on board with either one. But it's really difficult to find shared common ground with people in certain roles, in certain positions than others, partly because we never have the time. And as Bob was saying, you often don't come together. You're not even in the same room to talk to each other. So that was, it was nice to do that in a virtual way, literally and figuratively, in that I think most of the people were taking roles that maybe they don't necessarily fully ascribe to and did a great job. But it was interesting from that perspective.
Thanks, Carla.
Thanks, everyone, for being here. This was a wonderful process, and Marley and I have worked together before on designs of this kind to get to the underlying feeling of what's going on. And I think Marley introduced me to this process, and I have worked for decades with people using artistic kinds of methodologies to get away from what our heads are telling us all the time and into what an involvement with image, metaphor, making can tell us. And I think that this is just an especially good way for doing that. And I think that we had the methods we were pursuing today would kind of yield two products potentially that could be put together in a sufficiently long workshop. One would be to really go depthfully explore the gestalt of the made object, which I think we got a little bit of a chance to do with Wiz's build, because Marley asked such great questions about how we can place ourselves into the feeling state of every part of an object that we've created. And every piece of it has something different to say. For example, if I were to re-inhabit mine, I was thinking about what each of those pieces would have, what voice it would use for me and what it would tell me. And each of those was somewhat different. So that there's a really great self-discovery process that can be aided by people who add to it, who amplify it. The second product is, of course, the need for a dialogue, which can occur after we've gone somewhat away from our sloganeering. We start in our position of slogan, but we go into a depthful self-examination and then bring that to a much more enriched dialogue, which I think just has incredible potential with sufficient time spent doing it. So I just think this is a marvelous process, and I was really grateful to be invited to participate today.
Thanks, Hef. Lissena, did you want to speak?
Sure. I'm always impressed by the power of doing this kind of work, because when you start really trying to express a position, which was not my usual position, of course, that was more difficult, things happen that you don't expect, especially if you pay attention to your body. So I kept changing what I was doing, even though I thought about it before, more than I expected, to give a sense of this dual response I had. I also felt that going around and hearing other positions, I could feel started to modify mine. And by the time we got to the end, there was a process that actually did occur in my body as well as in my mind. So I guess I'd say those are the things that I take away from this right now most.
Thank you, Lissena. I think let's pass over to you, Marley, for what was it like for you?
I felt like a chicken with 8 heads, just running around, trying to pay attention to a lot of things at once. As you know, I mean, I told people before many of you came that this is like a spiritual exercise for me to flow with the unexpected. People don't show up, or they come in late, or people come in that I wasn't expecting, or some of the positions that I thought were really important aren't getting represented because someone had to drop out at the last minute, and so on. So all of this is sort of like a mirror of the chaos of social messes, of what we have to deal with on a much larger scale. That in this world and even in the other world, these things keep happening that we don't necessarily have control over. And part of our way of being is that we need to have so many different skills and the ability to be flexible and to see the opportunities that are occurring moment by moment, things that we didn't expect, and things that show up serendipitously, that help us along the way, and things that get in the way. And it's a whole process. So the paradox for me is that I have to be rooted in my individual experience and in the cosmic experience at the same time. And that's quite a challenge. And, I fail a lot of the time, but I keep working away at it. So this microcosm that we've been involved in today keeps reminding me of the macrocosm of the much larger kinds of issues, which a number of people here have been working on in different ways. And what is asked of us in order to be able to not just survive, but keep being our creative human selves in response. So I was fascinated by what you each did with this. You were very articulate and creative in your expressions. And I'm now, of course, imagining what some next steps would be and putting together some kind of a play that has these symbolic roles as characters and so forth and so on. That's what happens to me in my imagination. So I think that's all I'll say about it for now.
Thanks, Marley. So pass to Baeldon or Maureen.
Listening to people as you're going around the room, a couple of things came to my mind, and one of them was the comment that the actual geoengineering and the sort of all the technical aspects of this issue, and then suddenly said something like, we're thinking about the emotional dimensions. And I had this thought was that part of the struggle, I think, is to get these two together, to be able to handle the technical challenges and opportunities that Bob talks about in his wonderful murals, but also understand that it's human beings with an emotional life and a psychological life that has to cope with all this. So in a sense, we have to learn, we have to get better at handling the technical and the emotional at the same time and not separating them out. And I think this is a kind of an experimental space where we might want to play with that a little bit, which I think is really terrific. The other thing I began to recognize was how incredibly important it is to use the imagination in this very active way, to try to grasp things that are really too complicated to grasp just with the cognition. But imagination helps you to actually include so much more than you can include with a simple cognitive schema, for example. So that was very powerful for me to see imagination at work. The other thing, the power of dialogue and how imagination plus dialogue plus empathy, because there was a lot of empathy in the getting into the position and getting into each other's position. So the empathy, the dialogue, and imagination were three very powerful dimensions for me of what we did. But once we started dialogue, the defenses sort of came down and there was movement. There was a change from a defensive position into the possibility position, in a position where we could maybe move towards a growth or transcendence from our fixed, stuck positions. So I ended up seeing the process of transformation as possible when you put imagination, dialogue, and empathy together. And now just had to link that to somehow managing the technical stuff we have to deal with. And I think we have a sort of a glimmering of hope that with human creativity, this is manageable. Maybe not easily manageable, but maybe manageable. So I'm taking away some real thoughts about what kinds of learning processes we might create, whether virtually or in real time, to actually tackle this sort of mess on a much more emotional level or a holistic level. So I appreciate everybody's participation. It was very meaningful for me. And I thank everybody very much for letting me sit in on this. So thank you.
Thank you, Baeldon. So just to give the last word for this part to you, Bob.
Well, I'll echo, first of all, a similar feeling to what Neela said, of flowing with it when you're out of when you don't have any control. All the control mechanisms, of course, disappeared again on my screen for most of the time, so I couldn't stand up and walk over, and my avatar just sat there and took a nap. But I didn't. I was paying attention. Then suddenly the controls came back. I don't know why or how or anything like that. One of the things that struck me when the two sides, the me first and the spiritual, were talking to each other, I wondered if, I thought it would be really interesting if they could ask each other questions. What would you like to ask the other to understand that position more? That was one of the things that came for me. It also, in terms of imagination, what Maureen said at the beginning, before we even started here, I mentioned to a couple of people that the pathways diagram that I did, or mural that I did, I thought it would be really interesting to see what that would be like in 3 dimensions. And then what came out of the exercise was what would be happening if people were in the adopted positions that they had, the me first or the spiritual, and were walking down the path together and talking about this and what they were feeling and what new potential future events might cause them to feel in quite different ways. So that's where my mind was going part of the time. I'm still intrigued by the construction of the objects. So again, it would be interesting to see what would happen if the objects were being made, if we were to do something again in a pathway, if the objects were to be made or the pathway were to be reconstructed. I see people are quite good at that. I'm quite amazed that you were able to build a car, while I turned away for a moment and there you had a car. Those are some of the reactions I had.
So we're at the point of turning this over to Marley to complete this part.
This last part is really for Eldon and Baeldon to field your questions, if you have them, about what you saw or heard on their videos, and also about these charts. And I hope that you all had a chance to spend at least a few minutes looking at them and understanding what it is he does. One of these charts, this one over here, actually attempts to explain what this process is of this kind of map making and how it works and so on. If you have any questions, please address them to Eldon or Baeldon. If either one of you have any initial words that you want to say about your work that provides a context, that would be fine also.
I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has.
I'm curious, Bob, about how how you use the information and the diagrams and maps that you've been creating over. It's been a while now, hasn't it? I mean,
about 20 years.
Yeah.
Well, lots of different projects. In some cases, I work over, say, a 3-month period with a governmental task force. And we meet every 2 weeks or so for an afternoon, and we collect data from their discussions, in this particular case, about different difficulties that they're having with the messes that they're facing. And then we make the diagrams or murals in between on the computer and then bring them back to the next meeting. So that the focus is on building this a description. We call it a mess map, or a map of the social mess over time. And actually, it's a kind of thing where people get involved in really listening to each other very well, because the definition of a mess is a systemically interrelated set of problems. So that's one way. In other ways, we're currently working with a European task force where it's they're economists, and they're doing several large scenarios of the future and of the next 40 years. And so we've had several 4-day meetings, and in between, a sort of subgroup of the task force are on Skype with me once a week, and we're building up some pictures of maybe like the pathway mural that you can see there. So it really varies. And in other cases, for example, last fall, one of the murals was just exhibited at the City Hall in Seattle. And we had an event that was built around it, but the mural was there in front of the anteroom to the City Council chambers for 2 months. So everybody who was going to go in and talk to the City Council at least had to walk by it, if not to stop and study it. So there are a lot of different ways.
I'd love to ask you, Baeldon, Maureen, about something that you said a few minutes ago about the importance of imagination. And I'm wondering about that in your own work, as you're looking to kind of imagine the kind of person, kind of society that we need to evolve into in the future. I'm just curious about how you work with imagination.
Mostly we work with people who are using their imaginations and try to create prompts to them using their imaginations. Essentially, I mean, my work about the persons of tomorrow, some of that comes out of psychotherapy. I mean, I'm a Gestalt therapist, as Neela is, and haven't been a therapist for many years, but still use many of the methods to think about and to feel about and to experience. It's mostly working with people together collectively to imagine ways of conceptualizing a growth path in the midst of what seems like an overwhelmingly bleak scenario. So the data that's available could be organized around different scenarios for the future, for example, that you cut 1,000,001 data points, 4 or 5 possible futures can be made out of that. And then people can be asked to inhabit each of those different futures and think about what they would need to be successful in any of those particular futures. So building scenarios would be a way to move into an imaginary future based on data from the present, that data could be organized and coalesced around different kinds of stories. So using stories about the future, using images about the future, using scenarios about the future are all ways of imagining a world. Once that's imagined, then to consider what would be needed in that kind of a world. So, for example, one of our colleagues did some scenarios in India, which came out with 4 different possibilities for the future of India. And these possibilities were scenarios. One scenario he called Tigers Marauding, which was an image of India as being devoured by global capitalism and essentially leaving the bones behind, and the Indians having not much benefit from that at all. Another scenario was buffaloes wallowing, and this was a scenario of massive bureaucracies that can't do anything, that just basically look after each other and look after the bureaucracies, but don't ever actually produce anything for the people. And a third scenario was peacocks preening, and this was back to the Maharajas, the super rich, the absolute conspicuous consumption, and to hell with the little people. And the fourth scenario was called it Fireflies Rising. And Fireflies Rising represented a world in which hundreds of thousands of small entrepreneurs, small businesses were actually getting on with the business of recreating a new India, using the wealth that was now coming to India, but using it in a bottom-up. So once you have those four scenarios, you can start to think about, well, what kind of structures would we need? What kind of laws do we need? What kind of enabling conditions do you need to build for the preferred scenarios and to maybe avoid the not wanted scenarios? So that would be an exercise that a group of people could go through, that they would be using their collective imagination, they would be using their... it's a similar kind of process that Bob uses with the mess maps, except that the outcome of the scenarios process would be 4 different narratives about the world that is coming to be. And so that would be one way in which we would use imagination. But more concretely and more commonly in our work, we work with people who are artists, who are poets, who work in communities, work with children, work with disenfranchised people, people who are struggling with a world that they can't control and they can't understand, and they're overwhelmed and anxious. And we use imaginative processes to liberate their, in a sense, their growth impulse, their impulse towards growth and transcendence, to not get bogged down in the mess, to not be paralyzed by the mess, and to find their way forward. So there's many different ways, and this, what you're doing right now, might be a way to work. We could take on almost any problem and use imagination to think about new ways. I think Bob Horn once referred to it as a cold turkey reframe, where you can reframe the problem using your imagination and see what the world looks like when you reframe it. So these are the kinds of ways that we work with imagination.
I'm wondering whether people actually had the opportunity to watch Bob and Maureen's videos and to study these maps a little bit, and whether they were clear to you, or you had any questions about, for instance, how Bob actually thinks when he creates one of these things, like this climate change map. And I do want to mention that I think that Maureen also has written an important book called Dancing at the Edge. Is it Culture, Competence, and Organization in the 21st Century is the subtitle. And a lot of her ideas about putting together what are considered the ancient ways, the intuitive ways, the feeling ways of approaching these issues and science are spelled out in this book, and include also the idea of collaboration, of teamwork, and so on. And it's a good little book for you to think about owning. Bob wrote a book a while ago, which I think is still very valuable for understanding this approach, called Visual Language. And if you go to his website, I mean, you just have to Google Robert Horn Stanford, and you'll see that his website is also arranged sort of like a map, where you can click on different parts of it and get different kinds of information.
Well, I have to leave soon, but I was kind of intrigued with what I heard come up a couple of times from both Bob and Maureen that had to do with creating some kind of a pathway or scenario. I don't know if they were intended together, but my brain put them together, where you would have people walk down together a certain pathway and discuss, options or where they wanted to go or whatever. I could see those being really something you could do in a 3D world too. The problem is, so many of the people in the denial phase get into everything seems like propaganda to them. But I just thought that was a very intriguing idea to think about working on. So creating something where they're actually walking along some of these potential futures could be very powerful. Anyway.
Carla, there's some really, I mean, the scary thing is there's some very good stuff going on in the military right now in creating precisely what you're talking about. And taking the data isn't about climate change, although maybe they are doing some things on climate change, but a colleague of mine is doing a lot of three-dimensional pathway walkthrough experiences for cultural competency. That it would be a virtual world in another culture, and that it's designed for military people to experience themselves in a culture that's foreign to them and learn some do's and don'ts. But they're very sophisticated three-dimensional walkthroughs. So the basic skeleton for something like that may already exist, and I do think it would be a very powerful way, and I don't think it needs to feel like propaganda. It just needs to feel like an encounter with this information, or with these ideas, or with these threats, or with these opportunities. And I mean, I think it's a big deal to create such an environment, but I think it's already being used by the military to create all kinds of alternative futures. But of course, not necessarily a global balance. That's my political position coming out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that what the military is producing maybe has a different orientation than I was thinking of, or that maybe you guys would be thinking of.
Well, I thought, I was intrigued with the notion of walking down the path together, and stopping and discussing various steps along the way, or places along the way, maybe 5 years from now, on the pathway that might have been discussed, that how that would be different than the dialogue of talking across, or talking from the two different positions, the me first and the spiritual position that we did a little earlier, and what different kind of dialogue that might produce, even though there were people where the persons were staying in their role, or in their position, as we called them in this thing, the position. That's intriguing. What would it be like to carry your position that was not, that may not have been yours, but to walk down a pathway with someone?
Right, and I think that could be a very intriguing experience too. I think there's something about movement, and there was that thing where when we were all, we had the people on the spiritual platform and speech people on the me platform, and there were just the logistical things of the voices not carrying very well, and just feeling it was an oppositional thing, where what you're talking about is a shared experience, walking together and discussing as you go, which can be a different feeling.
Yeah.
I'm thinking that sort of in the spirit of an experimental laboratory, where my mind goes is, let's try out a number of different ways of bringing this kind of stuff alive. One would be certainly the one that Bob is talking about, like what happens when you do X, and then having people be moving around the space the way the global process works. People stand in a circle and they keep moving to different positions to express what that position represents. And then, as we did here, kind of other people amplifying the position, so that when you're dealing with any kind of issue, you try to develop as many different points of view as possible. And often what happens is that some new thing just emerges out of this once people have the experience. So it can be a circle, it can be walking on a path, it can be lying on the ground with your heads in the center and your feet out. I mean, there are a lot of different ways that could be experimented with to see what happens when you approach this work, different kinds of scenarios. We're very close to ending time. I want to just check to see if anyone has anything burning to say before we end the session.
I was interested to hear, Maureen and Bob especially, how you see this environment in Second Life, the possibilities for this in particular for carrying out this kind of and related kinds of work.
Well, I think it's an intriguing thing and something. I would love to have many years envisioned having a room with walls are all where displays could be put up and changed rapidly, and to come up with different ideas and synthesizing them in different ways and so forth. So I love that that aspect of it. I wonder if the room also contributes to, with positions, the 10 positions are in some sort of sense fixed, although they can obviously develop. And what intrigued me is, and that may be part of this, that is part of the structure, that is a context that I would say partially determines what can happen in this particular space. That is, there are certain kinds of dialogue that can happen.
Well, I'm still wondering. I'm not a believer yet. I'm not a The reason I'm not is because I think the technology gets in the way for me. It's like there's we've talked about this before. I still don't feel that that's me in there. I just think it's a thingy. It's like a puppet, and it's like I'm a puppet master, and you're all puppets. And I'm more interested. I wouldn't mind puppets. I like puppets, and I like puppet theater and so on. But I haven't gotten embodied yet. So it's still a work in progress for me. The dialogue was real. That didn't feel puppety. But the visuals for me, I could close my eyes and listen to the dialogue, and I think I felt more feelings when I did that than I did looking at the actual imagery. However, I have to say that this space is so beautiful. The artistry is amazing. I'm blown away. But it doesn't help me feel the stuff, the way the voices do and the way the actual words that people use. So I'm not a convert yet.
Baeldon, you're tuned into the auditory, but at the same time, you were looking at the visuals that people were creating, right? The objects and so on. And is that different from looking at avatars?
Well, yes, that was different. I mean, when we were talking about the green thing inside the black dome, I could see the relationship between the green thing and the black dome. And okay. I could see...
Yeah, I think it does take a while. I've been in here 7 years. It probably took me 3 years before I felt like that there was some kind of cohesion. It takes people different periods of time, and I do understand what you're talking about. And I'm hoping that we can keep experimenting. In case some of you don't know it, Bob is my ex-husband. We were married for 17 years, and we've been lifelong colleagues and friends. And we've talked for a long time about, collaborations, and we actually support each other's work in various ways. So it was a total pleasure to be able to bring him in here and do this kind of project. And Amy, Lucida, it turns out, knows Bob. So there was a connection there, and I met her here in Second Life and on a World Cafe. And we have not met in physical life, but I hope we do someday. And I've known Maureen for years and years and years. One of the things I love about Second Life is that it's so international. There are people who can gather in the same space, and Baeldon is talking to us from London, even though they are across the world. That to me is a very exciting kind of thing. I want to thank all of you very much for coming.